changing the way we plan and act. It's a great cultural challenge. This is what we're going to discuss now in the panel. We have some time constraints, so I immediately ask to join me on the stage here physically. There are some chairs here on the stage with Andreas Kipar, who's the founder of Landscape Architecture Nature Development Land, Andrea Ruckstuhl, who is the director of Lendlease for Italy and Central Europe. Then we have in connection Luigi Martignetti, European Network of Cities and Region for the Social Economy REVES, Shirley Rodrigues, who is London Deputy Mayor for Environment and Energy, and again here in Milan, Giacomo Pinaffo from Fondazione di Comunita di Messina, and Gemma Arpaia from ASviS Working Group on the Sustainable Development Goals, and especially number 17. And Stefan Schunig, please join me on the stage. You two are an architect, if I'm right, so you feel kind of comfortable discussing these kind of topics. Why are these so relevant for the foundation world?
Yeah, well, I think we already had a fantastic set of interventions here, and it shows the variety, but it all has one common ground. Obviously, the cities and the regions and the communities are the place where all the stuff that the G20 politicians discuss, where we're discussing about sustainable finance mechanism, where they, to some extent, have to be implemented. And I'd love to hear, you've heard from me enough from yesterday already, but I'd love to hear from this group some perspectives on the role of cities and some perspective with your experience in terms of implementing those changes and where the future ideas, maybe some of those we've been hearing today, 15-minute cities just as a new formula for polycentric urban planning, where this matches with you. Mm-hmm. So I hand over to you to
that's a fantastic kickstart for this. And I turn your points immediately to Shirley Rodrigues, who's in her role and appointment since October 2016. So she's seen many changes, but COVID-19 has been a great disruption. So how are you looking at the future of the city, which is typically not a 15-minute city in my experience, but how do you see the future and what are you working on?
Hello, and thank you very much. And you're right that as a city and as a massive city, it's not a 15-minute city, but there are lots of neighborhoods and actually people identify with their neighborhoods. And COVID-19, the several lockdowns that we've had to experience in London has meant that people have recognized the importance of their locality, but also the disparities in access, for example, to environmental, green spaces and so on, or the disparity in air pollution that people have really noticed. And obviously, as we're in the pre-COP build-up, the stakes really couldn't be higher. We have to come together in the name of tackling climate change, but also in London, we're trying to deliver a green and fair recovery from the pandemic. And the Mayor, Sadiq Khan, has been really clear that we have to tackle the climate emergency and become a net zero carbon city by 2030, but really just delivering it through that fair, just and green recovery. We've accelerated our target to 2030 in recognition of that emergency. We have plans and programs in place. We peaked our emissions and, we have obviously a lot more to do. One of the big problems for us in London is that we have huge challenges in cutting emissions from our existing buildings and our built environment, which is again the focus of some of the work that we're doing around maybe not a sort of 50-minute city, but how do we really make the localities for people much more environmentally fair and accessible. The pandemic, for example, exposed how unequal the impact is on people. Some of the most deprived boroughs in London, for example, were the ones that were hardest hit by COVID-19. And at the time, during lockdown, people noticed, they didn't have access. Around 1 in 5 Londoners, for example, didn't have access to any private outside space, and so they weren't able to go out to what is quite a very green city. But even so, we still have issues. So what the Mayor has done is asked that we look at making available now for people within a 10-minute walking distance, some good quality green space. And we do that because it's not just an environmental matter, it's a matter of social justice and health inequality. And so as we work to a net zero transition, we want this to be a just transition. And The other thing that we noticed is, the pandemic, in terms of sort of governance issues, London has 33 local authorities. We have a strategic authority with the mayor and the Greater London Authority, all individually doing things, silo working. We have the NHS and Transport for London and so on. And we recognise that, to tackle COVID and now to tackle the climate emergency, we really have to work collaboratively, and that really bears fruit. We've come together in a recovery board, a London recovery board, and this is co-chaired by the mayor, as well as the chair of all the London local authorities, the 33 boroughs. And it includes representatives from every sector, from the business sector, community sector, universities, health, and so on, because we know we all have a part to play in London's recovery, but also in how do we tackle the climate and ecological emergency. We've identified 9 missions, looking at how do we help our high streets to recover, how do we improve social cohesion, ensuring good work for all. And a key mission that I lead on is one that is embarking on a Green New Deal for London. Yeah. And this aims to double the size of London's green economy by 2030, but also in doing so, we're tackling the climate emergency, the ecological emergency, creating a more resilient city, and one that is really going to look to transitioning to that low carbon and circular economy that people have talked about. The mayor has put some funding behind this. So the first 10 million has been invested already. We're looking at sort of supporting district energy heat networks, solar generation. We're electrifying our buses. We're looking at how do our green spaces support the adaptation of our cities. We had a couple of flash flooding incidents this summer, obviously not as bad as Germany, for example, or in fact around the world, but we are seeing more and intense weather events. Wow. But a key part that I really wanted to highlight was how do we develop the skills of Londoners, those particularly hardest hit by the pandemic. We have our furlough scheme ending today, which means many more people will no longer be with a job. So how do we support them to get the new good green jobs that we need to develop in London? Wow. And the first part of that is understanding where are the issues. So we've done some research to help us target our funding and policy. We know that, in fact, actually London's economy is mostly service-based. 85–90% of our economy is service-based SMEs. 2/3 of our greenhouse gas emissions come from just 3 sectors: transport, electricity and gas, and manufacturing. And a key insight is how large a role, a disproportionate role, that workers from our Black and minority ethnic groups play. So we have to address those issues as we design those green and fair recovery policies. Yeah, absolutely. And of course, all of this needs to be paid for. We have a real problem in paying for that. So just in conclusion, I think I just wanted to say, London, along with many other cities and non-state actors, we're not represented at the COP negotiations, but we are the labs for climate solutions, and we have the legitimacy, as Charles mentioned earlier. So to meet national targets, achieve better outcomes for our citizens, governments must support us with the powers and fundings to allow us to accelerate the climate solutions that we need. So I really hope this is recognised at COP. Well, Shirley Rodrigues, thank you so much for this briefing from London. It's absolutely relevant to understand how one of the global major cities is approaching this, and you rightly mentioned how to pay for this, how to pay for closing the gap with inequalities and the climate change. And also you pointed out that governance has probably to adapt to this new situation. I know you have time constraints and you'll leave soon, but thanks again for joining us. Andreas, Kipar, you've got a wide experience in regeneration projects, especially based on the environment and a new relation between human nature inside the city. How cities will change after COVID, and which are the guidelines that you use when you approach new projects?
Oh, first of all, thank you very much for this opportunity. Really, I'm so convinced that cities will change in a really radical way because people were changed. So our approach, and I think that we never need to forget it, that first people, Jan Gehl talked it to us, then space, and then architecture. So I'm so sure that by people-orientated design, we have a real clear direction where we need to go. and people want something very, very easy. More green, more trees, more urban landscape, more public space in a safe way, and more visibility for our big goals. Because by living this transition time, we need some icons. We need something where people can go and say, okay, that's it. 30 years ago, we started to plant trees here in Milan. Now we have a big park. Mind will be really, and I'm so glad to be part of this team, an ecosystem of innovation. So, but it is different because now we are not more in a only constructive area. We are in a cultivating process. So this kind of cultivating process needs our all contribution. That is something that changed completely. There's no architect, there's no engineer, there are no single person can save it, but there are new formats. And Mind is some format. Our urban forestry projects worldwide are in format because people want to be part of it. And that is maybe our main experience that we want to push because at the end, we tried to take out nature from our cities. Now everybody asked us to bring in nature in our cities. So what does it mean? That changed completely our physical structures. That changed completely our daily habitudes from morning to the evening. So that is maybe the most exciting challenge for all of us.
Andrea Ruckstuhl, does it change also the way you look at projects when you, as a developer, you look at these kind of aspects?
Yeah, I think it's definitely influencing. I probably start always from our founder. You know, we are an Australian company. I represent an Australian company, despite being Italian. And he was really presenting the vision for cities in 1970s. And he said, you know, it's not far out that companies will need to look at beyond economic returns for our shareholders at environment and social outcome. I think he was far too early, and you know, he was unheard for many years, but that culture and that vision is now taking place. And we see in the last few years and accelerations on the understanding of these elements. So, and I think if we go into understanding how this might happen, it's three things I think are very important. One is commitment, and you know, our company Lendlease is committed to achieve absolute zero carbon by 2040, which is actually 10 years before the European Green Deal. In all our operations, all our projects across the world. And that means with no offset. Is it possible today? It is not. You know, if you ask me, can you do this today? I can't. You know, there are many things that needs to happen. And that's where the second step comes in. Second step is we need to move the entire supply chain. So we are dependent on many other elements in the economy. So this is a transition in many industry that needs to happen. And for that, we need a lot of support. We need skilling of people. We need to really work with the basis of all the industries to really progressively help through digital, through different materials and knowledge to arrive. That's where the work we're doing with some of the foundations are very important, because we need to shift together in this. And the third is governments. You know, yes, we set targets, but you know, I always use a very simple example. We're still bound to some urban rules that oblige me to build car parks today that are disproportionate to our vision. And I cannot not build them. So why are we still, you know, building things that are not of use, not of interest, and are not in the vision? We say we want to change.
The rules should adapt.
Yeah.
To the new situation.
Yeah.
And we are still thinking in an old way.
It's 1950 rule that it's mandatory today at Mind. So we're building the city of the future, and I'm using rules that were designed for another era. So how all these three elements, commitment from investors, which is happening, I have to say, is accelerating. work to transform the entire supply chain, and that's where foundations and governments need support and help, because it's an industry change and shift, and pivoting is happening, but slow, so we need to accelerate. And the third is, let's look at rules, fundamental rules that government still needs to look at to allow for the change. So if we do these three things, we'll be there by 2040.
Well, let me move also to Luigi Martignetti, who's remotely connected, because one of the points is, will the cities of the future be more inclusive? Because when it comes to the green transition, one of the risks is that rich people will live in very nice green towers or nice neighborhood, and the neighborhood, the marginal neighborhood, the periphery of these cities will be basically what they used to be, or worse than that. But what do you make of this, and what's your vision of what we're discussing today?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation, and also for this introduction, this point, because it was exactly what I was to talk about. First of all, we cannot split climate change in social or societal changes. Inclusive societies are as important as sustainable societies. But I would like to refer to something that was said by Mr. Landry when he underlined, when he reminded us the results of the elections in Lisbon and the worries for next coming elections in Paris. And in both cases, there is a connection, or is read as a danger connected with the fact that they've been introducing very much environmental friendly policies in that cities. But the problem is that maybe those electors who didn't vote for the former mayor in Lisbon, or might not vote for the present mayor in Paris, maybe they have their own reasons for doing that. Mrs. Rodrigues was underlining the fact that, especially in faraway neighborhoods, the situation of COVID-19 has been only creating more problems, more difficult issues, more difficult situations. So now what I think is that maybe we have to take back some instruments that were developed in the previous century. I've been listening to previous speaker who was right, saying that we have to adapt and we have to improve our capacity of making rules who can also change very fast. But we must also use a bit of the knowledge we've been developing in previous centuries, and namely in the 20th centuries. And I refer mainly to the fact that all this debate should be brought into the social sphere, should stop being a debate for public authorities or for bargaining between different groups of pressure, and become an argument for a large discussion, because we need appropriation by citizens. This is the only way where citizens, not subjects, could really make a contribution to the development of our cities in an affordable way, from a climatic point of view and from a social point of view. We have examples, and we have also the technology who's helping us to do this. If I refer to Barcelona, I must think of Decidim, the platform, the Barcelona platform, that is applying the logic of the participatory budgeting that is definitely from the previous century to the development of projects in the city. So we need to make this kind of shift and stop thinking that in this field, as we are dealing with very scientific issues, all the decisions should be based on that and therefore top down. I think that we need the pedagogy. We need to increase the capacity of citizens to understand problems and to find or propose solutions. Gaetano Giunta at the beginning of this, in the introductory speech, has been referring to the complexity. And climate change are the effect of complex events that happened during 3 centuries. We shall be ready to think that in order to try to deal with the problem, we should use the same level of complexity. Into the REV network, we have been developing instruments. REV is a network of public authorities mainly. We have been developing instruments pulling together environmental, cultural, social, and economic issues, and we shall use this kind, and there are others, and we shall use this kind of instruments. And also, we must remember that public authorities are an active player, which means they are buyers, and this was already said. but public authority can also choose what kind of economy they would like to support. It is not the same supporting Le Grand Voisin project in Paris or supporting the development of a big hotel or in the center of Paris. Putting money here or there is not the same. So we should make these kind of choices. We should follow what the citizens are able to suggest us, because they are ready. They are very good at suggesting very good ideas, and then implement without fearing too much of not being, let's say, re-elected at the next elections.
Well, Luigi Martignetti, this is the very focal point for every local authorities and every politician. But let me move, and we heard at the beginning from London, let me move to Messina. And as a project manager of different initiatives that your Fondazione di Comunità is developing, what's your approach? And given the resources and, you know, the social but also environmental conditions you're living in.
Sure, thanks. Well, actually, we've been talking about several items at the global level. So in terms of finance flows, in terms of regulation, technology, which are evolving to support the implementation of the transition. Still now they need to combine and land on the local level, at the community level. We need to work at that level, therefore, in order to raise the awareness of communities in order, on the social and environmental point of view, in order to make them capable of actually combining these elements, finance, technology, regulation, and implement concrete projects. That's the place where community foundations and other civil society organizations may play a relevant role. So I'll give you an example on what we are doing in Messina that can be also replicated. So for instance, there is this regulation, national regulation on the energy communities. So basically, the government is supporting the development of renewable energy communities. So people can join together and basically self-produce and self-consume energy coming from renewable sources. And the more the community produces and consumes and self-consumes, the more subsidies from the state you get. But so we have there the regulation, we have the technology, because it's quite evolved in this field, and we also have the financial schemes. But for instance, the regulations doesn't specify anything about how to redistribute the benefits in the community, within the communities, among the members. There is no rule on the governance, and these are relevant issues if we want to achieve a just and green transition. So as Community Foundation, we have developed, together with the National Research Council, a software and hardware system allowing energy communities to share energy and benefits, taking into account not only the quantity of energy produced and consumed, but also social criteria. So for instance, members of the communities which have a lower income or health issues may receive a higher percentage, a higher share of the benefits coming from the community. Obviously, this implies a recognition process, a bottom-up process at the level of the community to recognize the vulnerabilities, the social vulnerabilities within the community. And this is the kind of bottom-up process that requires time, but is needed in order to actually raise the awareness within the community and create a real community, instead of having just a group of people joining together with the people that they don't know, just to get some more subsidies from the state. That's the real difference, because otherwise what we achieve is a green transition for those who can afford it. But as a society, we cannot afford this.
Yeah, absolutely. This is an incredibly good point, and then we need the right indicator also to decide who needs that and who doesn't. And there's a large debate, as you know, also in our country on this kind of activity. Now, let me end up with this round with Gemma Arpaia from ASviS, because you're working especially on SDG 17, which is about partnership, global partnership, public-private partnership. Why is this so relevant and it's so important looking at the future of all the discussion we had today?
Thanks. Well, from the notes that I took in these 2 days, I would start with the item, the element of inequality, which has been underlined by several of the intervention. Inequality, as we've seen also with the pandemics, is growing. is growing and bringing us far from the vision of Agenda 2030. And it's growing within the country and across the country. For instance, with the pandemic, we have seen a huge number of poor people dying in New York and in New Delhi because they could afford safe housing or they could afford private care, medical care, and so on. So that means that inequality is growing, but the problem facing dealing with inequality are very similar in the north and the south of the world. So we think that the goal 17, the means of implementation and global partnership is the answer to this inequality across countries growing in those days. In our working group, we have a number of foundations, international NGO, civil society organization dealing with international solidarity. So we are connecting our practical experience in the southern country, in developing countries, and our advocacy and awareness raising in the northern countries. Because we think that putting words into deeds needs to have words, I mean advocacy and raising voice, but also deeds, that means practical and concrete achievement. Yeah. And I think that we basically have identified, and I can see also from the practical example that I'm hearing now, that there are some key elements for success in involving community in sustainable development. The first one is delivering visible results. People need to see results that make a difference in their life, in housing, in wages, in social protection. And a second aspect, and I think the example which has been made is basically building solidarity. That means avoiding a narrative based on polarization of, political thinking or bringing solidarity. For instance, the example that the colleague from community of Messina made, it's very similar on what is happening in a lot of African communities, where, some concept of dividing benefit among the communities, it's, secular on them. So I'm saying building solidarity is a second aspect. And the third one is securing credibility. I mean, the trust between communities and the state. But of course, that means make the state accountable of equal treatment of everybody under the law, enforcing the rule of law, and democracy, and enlarging civic space, and so on. And I can see that in our working group, foundation and international NGO dealing in development cooperation are just reflecting together on the principle that we have to, to bring us in our approach. Then we have different projects, different partner in countries, in certain countries. But I think that it's a very good experience what I'm making in the ASviS on that aspect.
Yeah, absolutely interesting. And I think that the COVID created a sense of community and necessity and solidarity. And even though we are reopening and some things we've got to get back as fast as we can as before, but we can build on that sense to create new conditions to rethink and reproject our spaces, our cities, and the relation and interaction inside the city. Stefan, what do you make of this content?
Well, I can certainly understand the different. I can certainly understand the different perspectives, and I can only agree with them. I love this idea of cities being the landing place for multilateral decision making. That's exactly what it is. I think you put it, Giacomo. 3 points that I just heard and that I just think are important to mention in the context of cities. First is, cities are not only about to mitigate the effects of climate change, but even more so in the next years, and we heard this from Shirley and we heard this from others, cities really need to prepare for weather extremes in the future much more than they have so far. This is really an important subject. It's about making the city resilient to weather extremes we actually can't avoid anymore. And they are coming, and we hear that they are coming. We heard this from Australia. So I think adaptation and mitigation really is an important subject, and there are solutions which address both, and that would be my choice for a city authority. The second point that also has been raised here is the question of governance. How do cities actually get the power to do what they want to do without necessarily having to ask regional or national governments? And this is a big subject being discussed in the UN Habitat subject in the UN Habitat context for many years, but I can only encourage to keep going, claiming more power for the cities, or at least a much better collaboration between national government decision-making and local decision-making, because it is only very rarely really happening. Another aspect of governance is important, not just, as we say, cross-sectoral collaboration. This is a bit of a buzzword. Yes, we know we all have to work together, but one aspect is really important. Not just the sectors need to collaborate, but also the departments of the different city authorities need to better collaborate. And there we need leadership from the city mayor saying, this is my target, and I want you, my departments, finance department, labor department, whatever, environment department, you come up with how you're going to reach that target. This can make a huge difference, and I've seen that in many cities, how this can unfold dynamic. And the last point is, which is more future-oriented, I'm a bit concerned how we deal with our data generated in cities, be it the data about how much water we use, be it the data what things we shop or what things we sell, be it the data, how much kilometers of mobilization we undertake in a city. These data are in many cities currently privatized to private companies, and it's hard to get access to these data when you want to do real scenarios and modeling for a city, how a trajectory through sustainability can look like. We've heard that from the Minister of Infrastructure in the morning. This modeling, this number crunching, really is generating political will, because it enables you as a mayor to say, well, I take that decision because I know what it will implement and I know what it will affect. So I take well-informed decisions. Well-informed decisions mean that you own the data and you don't give this data away to private companies sitting somewhere in Silicon Valley.
Absolutely, Stefan. And I think that the data aspect that you mentioned will be crucial for the future. The architect that built the space we are in transmitting, which is Professor Carlarati, he managed the Sensible City Lab at the MIT in Boston. His idea is that cities are sensible organisms that produces information and data. And if you use properly those data, we can create more efficiency and we can get closer to the targets that we all discussed. This and the help that technology can give us in reaching these targets hasn't been exploited that much, but I think will be one of the crucial aspects to looking at the future. So in an hour, Stefan, you will introduce us here the recommendation of the F20, because now for those who are here in Milan, it's time to take a break. And I want to thank again Andreas, Kipar, Andrea, Ruckstuhl, Luigi Martignetti, Shirley, Rodrigues from London, Giacomo, Pinaffo, and Gemma, Arpaia for joining the panel. We'll get back in 60 minutes. See you then.
Thank you very much,
Thank you.
Andrea.